Today, I get to continue in the series we started last week called Asking for a Friend, Scary Summer Questions. And this has been a series that's been driven by you. We asked you to submit questions to us or topics that you think we should address in a sermon, and you did not hold back. You asked some very important, thought-provoking, and to be honest, some very provocative questions. And so we're going to do our best to answer them this summer. And truth be told, not all of the questions that you submitted could be talked about in an 8-week sermon series. And so you'll see some of these topics that will fuel some future sermon series in the fall and maybe even beyond. But before we get started, let me reiterate a little bit of what Jeff said for you parents in the room. Let me add my voice to what he said, that today's message is a reminder, is a PG-13 rating. So yeah, if you have little guys in the room, it may not be the best day for them to be in here. So we encourage you to take them to MP Kids so they can check that out today. Now, we wanted to do this series for many reasons. First and foremost is that Jesus is not afraid of our questions. He's not. No matter how big or complicated they are, he can handle all of them, even if they are difficult. But we also wanted to do this series because Jesus and his word need to continue to define and redefine what we believe is true and what we practice as true. We also felt like we wanted to do this series because we wanted the next generation to not view the church as an unsafe or insufficient place for their questions or their doubts. Right? Young people, which makes me seem old when I say that, young people love asking questions. Right? They want to understand the reasoning behind things, and they're not comfortable with just saying, well, that's just the way that we've always done it. Right? They desire to engage in dialogue and discussion about what is happening in the world and how does it impact and what is Jesus all about in 2024. And that's what this series is meant to spark, discussion and dialogue. And speaking of that, we're actually going to have a time to do that on August 6th at the MP campus at 6:30. We would invite every single one of you to come because we're going to continue the conversation. There's 8 weeks in this series, so we're going to talk about the first 4 messages, and we're going to have a Q&A. And again, a time to continue the conversation about what we've been talking about in this series. So we would encourage you to attend. And then lastly, we wanted to do this series because we wanted all of us to embrace dissonance and disagreement. I mean, it's no secret that we can be a very polarized people, right? We have a lot of very strong opinions about a myriad of topics. And so we wanted this to be an opportunity for us to embrace dissonance and disagreement because we believe that dissonance and disagreement are the ingredients for growth. The church, you and I, must embrace them. Unless we disagree, unity is not possible. Let me say that again. Unless we disagree, unity is not possible. So our hope is to engage in these things and engage in dialogue and conversation around some really tough topics so that we can learn more about Jesus and one another. So with that said, I'm sure you're dying to know what the question is that we're going to tackle today. And that we're going to try to answer the question, can I ever stop giving into that struggle? And specifically, you asked us questions and suggested topics specifically around pornography and alcohol. And also overcoming sinful habits and patterns that we just cannot break. So, just a light summer topic on this Sunday. But at least I don't have rain on the stage like last weekend, right? That was pretty crazy. But if you've been around Mission Point for any length of time, you know that we do not and we will not shy away from the difficult topics that we face in the Bible and in our day. And so I'm going to do my best to address this question, and we're going to do our best to address them throughout this series. So let's start by talking about what this question is asking. So this question, can I ever stop giving into that struggle, assumes that we're giving in on a regular basis, which means we're giving into a temptation of some sort, right? And it sounds like it's a continual and ongoing problem that we have to deal with. You know, when we were fielding your questions about this series, we were trying to put them in buckets or in categories to try to find themes to address in a 40-minute sermon. And this question ended up under the category of addiction. Now, although these two things, porn and alcohol, are different, they have something in common, and they have in common that they can become an addiction, which is what I hear in this question of, can I ever stop giving into that thing? Right? It's a desperation to find out how to overcome this addiction and not give into the temptation. So the word addiction actually has two definitions. The first definition is to occupy oneself or involve oneself in something habitually or compulsively. The second definition is to cause to become physiologically or psychologically dependent on a habit-forming substance. Now, you might be already saying to yourself, well, Michael, come on, I'm not addicted. That seems a little bit extreme. I mean, I only take part in that sin every now and then. Or it's not necessarily an addiction. Okay, well, if it's not an addiction, maybe we try out the word habit. The word habit is defined as an acquired behavior pattern regularly followed until it has become almost involuntary. So if it's not an addiction, maybe it's a habit or maybe it's a pattern for you. Seems to me that whether it's an addiction or a habit or a pattern, it's getting to the idea of this question that we're trying to address. Can I ever stop giving into that struggle? It seems to me that the words ever stop would indicate that it is a habit or a pattern or an addiction that we cannot seem to overcome. But to be honest, I don't think it really matters what label we give it, because sin is sin, right? And whether we do it for the very first time or it's a habitual thing or it's an addiction, either way, it separates us from God because we do something we're not supposed to do. The Apostle Paul wrote about this in his letter to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 6. He says this, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You see, addictions and habits that we cannot overcome or break is being mastered by something. It means it takes over, right? We know it's not beneficial, but we cannot stop. We cannot control it. And as human beings, we do all we can not to be controlled by someone or something. But when it comes to these types of things, man, our willpower and our strong will just does not seem to cut it, does it? It reminds me of what I shared a few weeks ago in the 1 John series, what the Apostle Paul wrote in the book of Romans. It says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. You see, there's this battle, as we talked about, between this before Christ part of me, this 1.0 version of me, and this after Christ part of me, this 2.0 version of me, and there's this battle between the two. And when we give into that struggle, that sin, that thing that we cannot overcome, we give in to temptation and we lose the battle. We give in to temptation and we do what we know we're not supposed to do, or what we don't really want to do because we know that it's wrong. But why? Why do we continually do that? Well, sin is fun. It makes us feel good, at least for a little while, right? I mean, if anyone tells you that sin is not fun, they are fooling you and they are lying to themselves. Because if sin was not enjoyable, we would not keep going back to it, would we? Each time we do that thing, it gives us just a small dopamine hit, and it makes us feel good for just a little while. But then we have to face the consequences of our choices and our decisions. And this is exactly what happens to people who struggle with pornography. Remember, the first definition of addiction was to occupy oneself with or involve oneself in something habitually or compulsively. And the reality is that we have a porn epidemic in our world today. It does not take a lot of effort to see that sex shows up everywhere in our culture, right? The old adage that sex sells, oh man, it is alive and well in 2024. And with the use of smartphones and technology, it's far easier now to access or maybe even stumble on pornography. The Barna Group is a Christian research organization that provides data and insights for trends that are affecting faith and culture and ministry. And this is what they had to say about pornography. They said, pornography is pervasive, permeating our culture from shop windows to web ads, premium cable shows to smartphone apps, where once it was kept literally under wraps, used furtively in secret and shame, porn is now a standard feature of everyday life. Wow. I mean, just check out a few of these statistics from the Barna Group, and there's another organization called Covenant Eyes, which is an organization that helps people overcome their porn addiction and be restored and transformed. Check out some of these statistics. 90% of teens and 96% of young adults are either encouraging, accepting, or neutral when they talk about porn with their friends. 57% of teens search out porn at least monthly. Most teens are sexting either on the receiving or sending end of sexually explicit images. A few stats about that. 62% of teens and young adults have either received a sexually explicit image, and 41% have sent one, usually to or from their boyfriend or girlfriend or friend. And then this last stat is staggering to me. Many teens and young adults, 13 to 24, believe not recycling is worse than viewing pornography. And just so that you don't think that this is a teen or young adult issue, here's a few other statistics. The percentage of those who believe that porn is bad for society, it's only 43% of teens, 31% of young adults, 51% of millennials, 44% of Gen Xers, and 59% of boomers. All that together, just 55% of adults 25 and older believe that porn is wrong. Oh, and check out this statistic. 56% of divorces involve one party having an obsessive interest in pornographic websites. Over half. And while the percentage of men who are negatively impacted by pornography is greater than that of women, which is statistically true, porn usage among women is actually on the rise and is becoming more and more common, probably because of the digital access. So if you're sitting there thinking, this is just a guy issue, it actually is not. It impacts both men and women, because we also have to take into consideration erotic novels and other type of erotica that often impact women more than they do men proportionately. And there's this rise of pornography with technology, right? It's so easy to record and put porn out on the internet and on social media, which means you can either find it or produce it and become addicted. So the reality is that in a room this size, and for those watching online, there are probably dozens of people in this very room who wrestle and struggle with this on a regular basis. They work with you. They worship right next to you. And they struggle in silence because of the guilt and the shame that they have for this ongoing sin pattern in their life that they cannot seem to get a hold of. And these statistics, man, they're difficult to see and hear and comprehend, and they're sad because it impacts so many people. And I can relate to them because I used to struggle with this when I was younger. I grew up in a very overly sexualized environment where sex was talked about openly and often in very crude ways. And there were semi-nude pictures on my dad's garage when I was growing up. It was all around me. And I stumbled into porn when I was in my elementary age years. And man, it had a hold on me for so long, and it took a ton of time and a ton of effort and a ton of prayer to overcome this addiction and deal with my guilt and my shame. Because once porn gets a hold of you and it has its hooks in you, it's very hard to get rid of. And part of that's because we have these defense mechanisms to our sin patterns, right? We can maybe call them justification mechanisms, right? We can convince ourselves that it's not that bad, right? Like with pornography, we can say, well, yeah, but it's not that big of a deal if it's not really hurting anyone, right? I mean, who really cares, and why should someone be able to judge me for what I do in the privacy of my own home? But see, as followers of Jesus, man, we're called to be holy. We just sang about that, right? 1 Peter 1 says, but just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. And according to Jesus, porn is adultery. We read this in the Gospel of Matthew. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman or man lustfully has already committed adultery with them in their heart. You see, Jesus always ups the stakes. Where we think we can get close to the line without going over, Jesus does this amazing thing, and he redraws the lines and aligns them with God's heart. He says, oh, you think just having sex with someone that is not your spouse is wrong. Actually, what I'm saying is the way you look at people matters. And he goes on in this passage and he says, man, if your eye is causing you to sin, then pluck it out, because it's better for you to go into the kingdom of heaven with a one eye than to continue to sin. Now, he's not advocating for self-harm, but he's saying this issue of pornography and lust and viewing people in this way is a big deal, and it needs to be dealt with. The Apostle Paul also wrote about this idea in 1 Thessalonians. He says this, as for other matters, brothers and sisters, we instructed you how to live in order to please God, as in fact you are living. Now we ask you and urge you in the Lord Jesus to do this more and more. For you know what instructions we gave you by the authority of the Lord Jesus. It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the pagans who do not know God, and that in this matter no one should wrong or take advantage of a brother or sister. Man, I love this passage so much. There's so much to see in here. But first, we see that Paul is telling the Thessalonians that he gave them instructions on how to please God, and they came with the authority of Jesus. They were not just man-made instructions. No, these were a continuation of what Jesus said and did when he was on the earth. And Paul calls this church to holiness, to the process of sanctification, to continually being made more and more in the image and the likeness of Jesus. And he tells them, he said, man, you should control your bodies and not engage in sexual sin like those who are around you who don't know God, because he says that's not what a follower of Jesus looks like or acts like. The reality is that pornography is lust, plain and simple. Pornography is lust. And lust is a selfish focus on sex, or a desire to have a sexual pleasure with someone else other than your spouse. And as we read earlier, we already know what Jesus thinks about that. And man, I love the way that Paul ends this passage. He says, we should not wrong or take advantage of a brother or sister. You see, in essence, that's what pornography does. It reduces someone, a human being made in the image of God. It reduces them to an image for my pleasure. And by taking part in pornography, it's like we're taking advantage of a person that God made and God loves. So engaging in pornography is a big deal. It is sinful and it is not God's design for sex. So how do I keep from giving into that struggle? Well, I want you to hold that thought because I want to address the second definition of addiction, right? Which we said was to cause to become physiologically or psychologically dependent on a habit-forming substance as it relates to alcohol. Now, there might be some misconception in the room about alcohol because if you grew up maybe in a Baptist tradition or in a conservative Christian background, you might have been told that drinking is a sin. But nowhere in the Bible do we see that. Right in John chapter 2, Jesus was at a wedding, right? They ran out of wine, and so he did his first public miracle, right? He made water into wine. And so if drinking wine was a sin, I don't think just Jesus would make more wine for people to drink. So I don't think drinking is a sin, but we do, however, see many scriptures about being drunk, being inebriated, or being intoxicated. Ephesians 5:18 says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. Romans 13, let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing or drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Proverbs 20, wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. Proverbs 23, do not join those who drink too much wine. And Titus 2, likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. So it seems like having a drink is not a sin, but getting drunk is. And an addiction or a habit of getting drunk regularly is a big deal that should be dealt with. And many of us know this all too well, right? A couple of weeks ago, I shared with you that my story that my dad was an alcoholic. Now, when in my younger years, I have these great memories of my dad where we just had fun together. And actually, a lot of my fun, loving, energetic personality comes from my dad. And I remember these memories of us wrestling on the floor and him calling himself Ultimate Dad, and we had a lot of fun. Or watching football with him down in the basement next to the fireplace. And I had lots of great memories with my dad. But when I got into high school, something began to change. Because my dad's business started to struggle. And rather than just having a beer or two on the weekend, he started having a beer or two every night after work. And then that beer turned into one and turned into two and turned into three, where he was actually going through a case of beer every day or two. And he wasn't ever physically abusive to us, but oh boy, could he get angry, which is one of those things I have to continually work on from what I grew up with. I remember one time that he picked up the Christmas tree and he threw it across the room. Or he came in one time and he kicked a hole in the wall. I think it was because somebody drank the last Pepsi. I don't know, something really silly and dumb. Man, I wish I could tell you that the end of the story was redemptive and turned out well and there was a pretty bow on the end, but it's not. My dad has been in a nursing home for the last 24 years of his life in South Bend with alcohol-induced dementia. Alcohol ruined his life. It had a devastating effect on his life, and to be honest, the life of my family as well. And I'm not saying that if you have a drink, that's going to always happen, but it certainly has that capability, doesn't it? And just check out a few of these statistics about alcoholism from the World Health Organization, Center for the Disease Control, or Peer Research Group. It says this: more than half of U.S. adults reported drinking alcohol in the past 30 days. Approximately 17% of adults binge drink, and 7% report heavy drinking, and nearly all adults who drink heavily also binge drink. About 1 in 5 adults who drink alcohol, that's 19%, say that sometimes they drink more than they should. This statistic boggles my mind. 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 12 have an alcohol use disorder. And on average, 385 Americans die every day. That's over 140,000 a year as a result of excessive alcohol use. And so, like pornography, the reality is in the room this size, there are probably dozens of you who are sitting in this space and watching online that struggle with this on a regular basis. Right? These are people that they work with you, they go to church with you, they shop next to you, and they too struggle in silence because of the guilt and the shame they have for this sin pattern in their life. So how do we keep from giving into that struggle? I mean, what are we supposed to do with this today? How do you and I stop giving into the temptation and sinning for that thing over and over and over and over again? Well, I'm glad you asked, because whether you're dealing with pornography or alcohol or any other sin pattern in your life, because of Jesus, there is a way to overcome. There is. The Apostle Paul wrote about this in his letter to the church in Corinth. He said this in 1 Corinthians 10. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. The good news? The good news is that whatever your sin pattern, whatever your addiction or your habit you're facing, you are not the only one. Let me say that again. You are not the only one who is struggling with that thing. These sins and issues, they are not new. Men and women have been dealing with these types of things since sin entered the world with Adam and Eve. And I don't know about you, but that brings me some comfort, because sometimes I think we can get into such negative self-talk that says, I'm the worst person in the entire world. But when I read that others have had these struggles too, that my issues are a common problem, I don't feel so alone in the struggle. And this is huge, because we can get into this shame cycle with our sin patterns, right? Author and speaker Brené Brown talks about this in her books. She says that guilt is a good thing. Guilt is a good thing because it brings conviction when I do something wrong. Guilt says, I did something bad. And that's okay for us to acknowledge. But shame, on the other hand, shame is destructive, because shame says, I am bad. You see, when I feel guilt for my sin, it helps me know that I need a Savior, that I need forgiveness, and that I can go to God who loves me and ask for that forgiveness for the thing that I am guilty for doing. But shame often blocks that reality from happening. And it creates this narrative in me and probably in you that says, I'm so bad, I don't even deserve a Savior. And I love the way this verse in 1 Corinthians 10 says that God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, and he will provide a way out. Right? I'm sure you can recall how God has come in the right time at the right place, right? Maybe you were going to do something and someone called you or texted you or walked in the room at the right time and said they were praying for you, right? God is faithful and he will provide a way out. All we have to do is do his way instead of our way. We need to seek his will and not justify our behavior or our choices. Okay, so at this point in the message, let me get insanely practical with you about how to overcome that struggle. So I have 4 things I want to share with you, and yes, they all start with H, okay? First, in order to overcome that struggle, honesty is key. Honesty is key. Do you realize that the easiest person to deceive is the person in the mirror? The easiest person to deceive is the person in the mirror. As human beings, man, we have a way of lying to ourselves to justify our behavior so that we do not feel guilty. Or at the very least, we lie to ourselves so that we can run as far away from guilt as humanly possible. So honesty is key if we're going to overcome this struggle. We need to be honest with ourselves and ask hard questions that are like, what's the thing under the thing under the thing that's driving this behavior or sin pattern in me? In his book, Better Decisions and Fewer Regrets, which I could not highly recommend enough to you, author and speaker and pastor Andy Stanley wrote this. He said, "You can't make the best decision for you until you are honest with you. Ask yourself the question, am I being honest with myself really, or am I selling myself a regret?" Wow. Right? That's powerful. Am I selling myself a regret? I mean, I don't think any of us would say, yeah, I want all the regrets I can take. But we do that for ourselves often, don't we? We lie to ourselves and sell ourselves a regret. I mean, as it relates to pornography and alcohol, you can get honest with yourself. And you can ask yourself really hard questions and say, am I going towards this habitual sin or pattern or addiction because I am lonely? Or am I really just sad and depressed? Or maybe I just have too much stress in my life, or things are crazy at work, or I have relationships that are on the rocks. Or honestly, if you get honest with yourself and say, I'm just going to that thing because I'm bored. You see, getting curious and honest will help you make better decisions and have tons and tons of fewer regrets. And I know I want less regrets in my life. And remember, Jesus said this in the Gospel of John, then you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. You see, if we're honest with ourselves, we are free from the bondage of our sin. So be honest with yourself. Don't shy away from looking in the mirror. Don't sugarcoat it. And don't say you deserve the thing that you think you deserve. Be honest with yourself. That's the first step to overcoming that struggle. The second part is that humility is required. Humility is required. You see, when we're dealing with our sin, it requires us to humble ourselves before the God of the universe and say, I've done something that has broken our relationship. See, it requires us to take it out of the darkness, bring it into the light, and confess before the God of the universe. And we see a bad example of this in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve, right? They sinned, they ate from the tree they weren't supposed to, right? But rather than coming out and confessing their sin, what did they do? They hid from God in the Garden of Eden. They wanted to keep their sin in the dark. It's the same thing we read and see in John's gospel. He says this in John 3. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. You see, in order to overcome that struggle or that sin, it requires a humble posture to bring things into the light, to bow down low, admit to the God of the universe that we did something wrong and we failed. And it takes a lot of humility to do that. But I don't know about you, it's true for me that sometimes I'm just too proud or too strong or too strong-willed or too defiant to admit it. I mean, listen to these words of confession from Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. You see, that prayer requires a lot of humility before the God of the universe. And also, humility is required because in this process, we might have to eat some humble pie with our family, our spouse, our colleagues, our friends, right? Our reputation might be impacted, right? Once we humble ourselves before God of the God of the universe, we might also then have to humble ourselves between the people that we have hurt and that we have impacted. And we might have to reconcile with someone that we have wronged, right? If you're an alcoholic, you might need to take a few weeks off of work and go into and admit yourself into an inpatient facility to get the help that you need. And yeah, you're going to have to let your boss know. And that means your colleagues might also find out, right? This requires eating some humble pie for sure. Maybe you saw it in the news, but this happened to one country singer just recently, right? She was singing the national anthem at a Major League Baseball event and was intoxicated the whole time and had to admit herself into a program. And yeah, her reputation has taken a few dings, but she's doing what she needs to do to get healthy. Which leads me to the third point, that help is essential. Help is essential. The reality is, if we could get a handle on the thing that we're struggling with, we would have done it already, right? As human beings, we often need help outside of ourselves to overcome the thing that has a grip on us, right? That's where things like accountability come in, right? In fighting a close friend or a family member or a colleague into the mess of your situation and giving them permission to get all up in your business and ask the tough questions, even if they make us angry. Right? Let other people set the rules for you, because as human beings, we are terrible at setting boundaries for ourselves with something that is an addiction or a habit or a compulsive pattern that we have in our lives. So let someone else decide the privacy settings or the monitoring software you have on your phone or your Wi-Fi network. Right? Let someone else decide if you should join your coworkers at happy hour, even though you're saying, all I'm going to do is have a soda. Right? This means giving control over to someone who has your best interest at heart so that you can regain control over the things that you become addicted to or that you struggle with. And this is helpful because we are stronger together than we are alone. Right? There is strength in numbers, right? King Solomon knew this when he wrote these words in the book of Ecclesiastes. He said, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. You see, Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, knew that we needed others to keep fighting the battle, to walk alongside us so that we don't give up and give into that sin pattern. I mean, do you have someone in your life who knows the ugliest parts of you, still walks with you, and still loves you? If you don't, I think you should absolutely go find that person so at least we can have, and you can have, a fighting chance. And then help being essential means that it can also come from a community of believers, being surrounded by people who love Jesus, who love you, and who will support you in the good times and the bad times. This is why we encourage every single person who comes to Mission Point to get into an MP group, because this is a group of people who, when you are at your darkest, when you are at your weakest, when you are struggling in that thing, you have a group of people in the church who love you, who are willing to walk alongside you and be able to pray for you. It's the beautiful benefit of being part of a church, being part of a body of believers, because we can be there for each other. And yes, help being essential might mean that it means getting professional help from a counselor or an addiction program. And can I say this? There is no shame in going to an AA meeting. There is no shame in going to a Celebrate Recovery program. Honestly, the most beneficial thing that you can do, the healthiest thing that you might be able to do for yourself is to get the courage to darken the door of one of those programs because it just might save your life. And lastly, in order to overcome a pattern of habitual sin and addiction, we should be Holy Spirit dependent. Holy Spirit dependent, meaning that God can work through the power of the Holy Spirit to help us overcome our addiction. Romans 8 speaks to this. It says, "But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you." This is amazing. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead, lives in you and me. That same power that we can depend on. This is power beyond power. Power that when we've tried everything else, we can depend upon the Holy Spirit who is there with us along the way. We can run to the Holy Spirit and to Jesus because he is faithful. And beyond that, we have a Savior who knows what it's like to be tempted. We read these words in Hebrews 4. It says, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness." Hallelujah. "But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. So then let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." Isn't that awesome? Jesus understands our struggle. And when we call upon Jesus, when we come to Jesus, guess what we get? Well, guess what we're greeted with? Grace. Glorious grace through the love of Jesus. When we come to him. And the good news is, his mercies are new every single morning. So we have an opportunity to make tomorrow better than today. We have the opportunity to say, today was not great, but tomorrow can be different. And then the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that. Daily surrendering to Jesus. Like they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, just one day at a time. So how do we ever stop giving into that struggle? Well, we do it with honesty, with humility, with help, and with the Holy Spirit. One day at a time. Which I guess makes me think that there's a fifth H, which is hope. Because with Jesus, we have hope. We have hope that today can and will be better tomorrow with Jesus by our side. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this word this morning. We thank you for the reality that in our brokenness, in our sin, God, you desire for us to be sanctified and to be made holy and to be made right with you. And although we fail over and over again and time again, God, your grace does not run out for us. And thank you for that. And so, God, I pray that you would just continue to speak to us in this room, whatever our thing is that we're struggling, whether it's pornography or alcohol or some other sin pattern, God, that you would continue to help us to be honest with you and with ourselves. That, God, that you would help us to humble ourselves before you and others. That we would get the help that we need, and that, God, by the power of your Holy Spirit, you would help us to break the chains of this. In Jesus' name, if we are struggling right now with a sin pattern, God, we pray in Jesus' name that you would break the chains of this addiction and this sin pattern or this habit that continues to plague us. Because we know that you are powerful over all of those things. And so we give all the power and the glory and the honor that is due your name to do all of those things that more than we could ever ask or imagine, God. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.